Jonathan Blow, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thank you for having me here.
I'm very excited about this.
Yeah. I
I,
am
I've,
excited too, but as I warned you just before the stream, I'm not 100% awake, so I'm going to hopefully warm up as we go.
that's fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I first came across you because of an interest in game design.
Okay.
Then more recently, on wider software topics, technical things. I'm a programmer, and quite recently I've been interested in some ideas about society more broadly, and I think there's some crossover in the thinking that goes on when you're analyzing a software problem, and then you look at society and say, I spot similar patterns. Um, so let's discuss.
Okay.
Let's start with, because some of my audience is not so technical, um, how much faster is a computer today versus a computer 20, 30 years ago?
Okay, it's not really that simple, but in broad terms, just tremendously, amazingly faster, right? So one example that I used to give 5 or 6 years ago, and computers are faster now than they were 5 or 6 years ago, is that my phone, which was like an iPhone 7 or something, was faster than the fastest supercomputer in the world when I was in college that was very difficult to get time on and was used to simulate like nuclear explosions and whatever, right? And there were very few of them in the world, and now like everybody has more computation than that, right? If you just want to pick numbers, it's been a while since I ran these numbers, but it's like millions at least, right?
Yeah, yeah.
The reason it's not totally simple is there's several factors. There's like how fast does the computer run? There's how much is it doing at any one instant, right? And there's a few different ways to measure that. And then there's sort of this trade-off where modern computers crank really fast when they're doing well, but then they also get really bogged down really easily. And so it's not as straightforward as the raw numbers would predict, but they're just so much faster. Like, it's just insane. I never would have imagined it.
Some caveats aside, but basically for people who haven't looked into it, just assume it's a multiple beyond what you can imagine.
It has a lot of zeros.
Yeah. But what about the user experience? Presumably, a person using a computer compared to 20 years ago is having so much of a slicker, easier life, and that it's just a joy to use computers, right?
No, really not true. I mean, on average, I would have to say it's probably a little bit better. So then I have to pick a point in time of comparison, right?
Okay, yeah.
I could pick 2 points in time, right? So one point in time that's very close to today in a lot of ways is when I was in college, which because I'm old was like 1989 to 93. So let's just say the early 90s, right? And the computers that we used at that time were basically the same thing that we're using today, right? 30 years ago. Now this was a little bit advanced because everybody's home computer was a few years behind. Like if you used Windows, it took until probably Windows 98 for most people to get the same thing that you had like in college. But basically, to get technical, a multi-user operating system running protected memory that could run multiple processes and communicate over the internet and all that, right?
Yeah.
So you had that in the 90s, and you ran programs by clicking on icons, and
If your
programs
job
were
was
basically mostly the same.
if your job was working on word processor or a spreadsheet application, Windows 95 on the hardware that it came out on, and a computer you buy today with the software that it gets is, I would argue, very similar experience.
Yeah, I think Windows 95 didn't have inter-process memory protection, which is actually a big deal because it protects
That
your machine
prevents
from
some
going down
crashing.
very easily. But
Yeah.
aside from that, yeah, like if you just want to talk about user experience when things are working well, yeah. And the only reason I would say it's maybe a little bit better now than when I was in college is because those machines were so underpowered compared to what we had today that drawing a screen full of pixels was like a big deal for them, right? Now we can do it thousands of times per second, but these were machines with like 8 MB of RAM, right? Everybody
Yeah.
these days has 8 GB of RAM or more, right? So we have 1,000 times more memory. We have, CPUs that again are much, much faster. And so that's the main reason that maybe the experience was slightly less. I would say, 25% less
Right.
than what we
What
have
about the
today.
experience of being a programmer in the mid 90s? Take your average person who considers themselves a professional programmer then versus now.
It's complicated. Again, because, okay, so there are many trends that proceeded over time, right? One, again, computers are tremendously faster. That helps a lot because, if you want to do whatever tasks you set your computer to doing while you're programming, they could happen a lot faster. At the same time, though, just like all other software, all the tools that programmers use have gotten tremendously slower. So like it takes a lot longer to compile a C++ program today than it did in 1995. Why? Well, I still don't completely understand it, but I understand a lot of things about it that people don't seem to want to admit.
Yeah. So one way of looking at it might be that
Yeah.
you know this handshake problem where as you increase the number of features and they may all
Yeah.
talk to each other, the complexity grows exponentially. So whilst you might think the differences between the word processor in 95 versus today is superficial, things like, well, now you can collaborate online with other people, or
Yeah.
now it will render on a 1080 display rather than a little 640-480 thing. Those little differences add up and actually push out beyond the edge of.
Yeah, they do, and that's a real thing. However, right, this is where discussions like this, like whenever you try to talk to people about how software is doing, right? I've tried to do this on a number of occasions, and basically there's 3 groups of people. There's people who don't care at all, like whatever software.
Yeah.
I don't know, not my life, right?
Yeah.
There's like people like myself and my friend group who look at it and say it's a complete disaster, and then there's people who seem to me, who may be a biased observer, to seem very emotionally somehow attached to the idea that software is great and doing well. And like are not seeing the same thing that we are seeing, right? And so
Yeah.
the problem is we're about to step into a place where you see what you want to see, right? And I'm gonna explain why a little bit, right? So what you said is exactly true. Features do add complexity, and you can see this very simply. Like, I want to add something to my word processor or whatever program it is. I'm going to add some if statements to check if I should do this thing now. That's code that it takes time for the computer to do those if statements, right? There's nothing magical about that. However, what we actually observe is much, 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 much worse than the necessary amount of overhead required to implement the features that we see. And this is something that happens everywhere, right? And so people make an argument, especially if they want to think that software is doing well. They say, well, as programs grow in complexity, you would expect them to get slower, and we're solving more difficult problems today and stuff. And okay, that's true a little bit, but you have to say you have to ask how much complexity has been added relative to how much complexity should have been added, right? And this is a very, very, very important question because, I wish I had slides, right? But for people who know a little bit of math or whatever, imagine you're making a little graph. So you have a dot or a node, and you have another one, and you have another one, and you just draw lines connecting all of those, right? So if you have three and you add a fourth one, you're connecting it to three others. And if you have four and you add a fifth one, you're connecting it to four. Everything you add adds more lines to all the other things, right? And that's what we call a combinatoric explosion eventually, where it gets very, very expensive to add new pieces, right? And the goal of software engineering, in some sense, is to prevent you from having to connect all those lines to all those things. We like compartmentalize. I apologize to people if this is too abstract to make sense, but we compartmentalize and we try to prevent them from interacting, right? That's like good software engineering, but we usually fail at good software engineering, right? And so what happens is, as a program grows, you spend an inordinate amount of energy dealing with the constraints that are already in place. And the friction goes up and up until you can't do anything anymore, right? And so it is incredibly important to keep that friction down, especially in long-lived projects. Now, what does keeping that friction down mean? Well, it means reducing those number of constraints between things, which is minimizing the complexity. And this is where it's very important to be clear about things, right? Because people will argue solving problems is complex. It involves complexity. And then they use that as an excuse to justify the complexity that they see in current software. But it's not right, because there's a certain amount of complexity that is required to solve a problem, right? Like whatever is the algorithmic complexity of that problem. But usually when we sit down and write software, we're not perfect. And so our implementation is more complicated than it needs to be, right? It maybe even gets wrong answers sometimes, or doesn't handle all the inputs and all these things. And so what we build is always more complex than what it should be, ideally. And the problem is, because complexity interacts with complexity in a super linear way, it explodes. Then the worse you do now, the worse you do in the future. It's like compound interest in a bank account, but like a very bad version of that.
Yeah.
And so what we've got today is a lot of compound interest. So much so, like, I actually had an exercise where I sat down and like, if you just look at everything, you try to look at everything that exists to make a computer run today, which nobody actually understands everything, right? But you sort of look at the parts you understand very well, and you extrapolate out to the parts you vaguely understand, and you say, okay, but what do I actually need to do what we're doing? Like, let's just say I wanted to run my desktop environment and run the programs that I run and do the things that I do. Like, how much of what we have right now do you actually need to do that? I don't actually know, but it's easily far less than 10%. It's probably a lot less than 1% or 0.1%, right? Like, it's really a lot less. And, if you could somehow wave a magic wand and make that happen, a lot of things would be better, right? Now, that's not really possible to do that. But I think it's important to at least be able to observe that, so that moving forward, you can sort of notice problems in your own stuff and see, like, okay, how do I deal with this? How do I stop sliding into this like pit of despair and horribleness that we've been sliding into for decades?
Working with people who are new graduates, a very common mistake is overgeneralizing everything that you write. You think not just what's the problem I'm trying to solve, but what are the adjacent problems that I could be solving at the same time, and you immediately add complexity, and it can increase the time it takes to write the software by orders of magnitude. And I tend to think this is just a lack of experience. But then I wonder, would people behave this way if they weren't just new graduates, but were actually just new to programming? Is there something in the way we teach programming? I mean, I think my personal experience has been that I have had to unlearn all the things I learned at university And my
Yeah.
manner of programming now is much more similar to what I did when I was a teenager than what I was doing when I was a new graduate. So are we actually making the problem worse than it has to be?
Well, I think we are. I don't know if that's the entirety of the problem, right? I don't know what
Yeah.
people would do in the state of nature, right? But definitely
Hobbesian programming. Yeah.
Yeah. People are taught to solve problems by adding abstraction layers, right? And what is never really admitted is there are several things that are not taken into account in this scheme, right? One, your abstraction layer cannot ever perfectly abstract, and it cannot ever tightly couple between the layer above it and below it. And so it's always adding some slop, right? And then also your abstraction layer, it's not like pure math living out in the Platonic world somewhere.
Right.
It's code that has to run, right? So it
Yeah.
has weight, and
Yes.
it adds complexity, right? It takes time to compile. It makes things harder for people to understand because more volume of anything, you have more things to understand, right? It takes time to compile. It takes time to run, and so I wish that we thought of code in a little bit of a material science way. Like you could imagine that. It's like, okay, some code is a lot like, softer and doughier and won't support much weight
Yeah.
because it's, and some code has a lot of like flaws and imperfections and will shatter if you press on it. And some is very
Yeah.
robust and strong and you could build a taller building out of it, right?
Yes.
But no matter what, any kind of material, as you add more material, you add more weight to the thing, right?
Yeah.
If you're building a rocket ship, you're very, very careful about how much material you add because you know that there's a very large penalty, right? And I don't think our penalty is as bad as a rocket equation kind of penalty, but it's a lot worse than we admit. Right? All this code has a cost.
There's cases where a problem will grow in a predictable way and then hit a moment of inflection and then sort of break and suddenly get way worse. I sometimes wonder whether there is a factor like this in software where you have how much complexity can a system have up to the point where one person can understand all of it, and it scales quite sensibly until you hit that point. And then as soon as you need to decompose the problem into pieces and no longer can any individual understand it all, the way that people work on the system just breaks. You can no longer identify issues because there's nobody who sees both sides, both of the causes of a given issue. So back in the mid 90s, you could imagine that somebody understood the entirety of Microsoft Word, but its descendant, however many years later, is probably unmanageably complex, and so it's like a difference of type, not just a linear scaling problem or even an exponential scaling problem, but just fundamentally broken.
Absolutely. I mean, as soon as you go from one person to two people, the quality goes down, right? Everybody knows, or not, I mean, a lot of people are familiar with the mythical man month ideas about scheduling as team size grows. Like, two people don't program twice as fast as one person because there's an interface cost, but they could be maybe almost twice as fast. But, 7 people is not 7 times as fast as one person because there's all these costs to coordinating, right? Those costs, though, are not only in time, they're in quality of understanding and quality of the resulting output, right? Programmers who have experience probably can relate. It's like you program some stuff, and if you're good at engineering, you're architecting for future plans, and you're like, oh, I designed this thing this way because if we ever want to do this other thing, we can just rotate this thing by 30 degrees and like do the thing. And then someone comes along later, even if you're still on the team, I don't know, who doesn't understand that, and then they go do a whole bunch of stuff to make the thing happen that would have been like 10 minutes or whatever. And this is common, right? And you try to solve this problem by having good communication, but that's very difficult You know, then everybody spends a lot of time in meetings and everybody's demoralized, and then they're not productive because they're spending all their time in meetings, and then you need more people, right? Like, if you spend 50% of time in your meetings, you need twice as many programmers, except you need more than twice as many because twice as many is not twice as fast. So like, things start to spiral pretty quickly. Yeah.
So just to give an example of the Kafka-esque experience of being a programmer at the moment, I was working on a project recently. I joined a project, and there was a situation where somebody was working on their laptop. They were then having to connect to a virtual machine that was their development machine. They were running inside the virtual machine. So it was a Windows virtual machine, but then they were using Windows Subsystem for Linux. They were then wanting to spin up a bunch of Docker containers to run another operating system. So you've got sort of, what's that, 4 levels of embedded operating systems working one within each other. And just to get anything to work is more like a set of box-ticking form-filling exercise than anything. I mean, when you start programming, the joyful experience is writing algorithms and solving problems using this is almost like a recipe. Here's what we're going to do. But now it's more like there are these black boxes of software that you have to coax into operation. How have we got to this point?
Yeah, this should have rung alarm bells a long time ago. Like, what is the fundamental thing that these computers do is they run code, right? That's like what your CPU is trying to do. Try to get your CPU not to run any code. It's very difficult, right? It's running something all the time. And yet somehow, to deliberately run programs that we want to function correctly, we've made it so complicated and so difficult, right? It's like, it's becoming impossible, you know, and that's not an exaggeration. It becomes harder and harder all the time just to run a program. And like, why are we doing that? You know, because certainly if it's harder to run a program, then it's harder to run a program that does the thing that you want, because that's a subset of running a program at all. And we just, you know, here's another thing that happens is, you know, back in the old days, it was not very glamorous to be someone interested in computers. You know, I don't know how it was in other places, but here in the US, you were basically a terrible nerd and everybody used it as license to despise you. Well, despise is not the right word, but to denigrate
jock
you and look
versus
down upon
nerd
you.
divide,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and so the people who did it were the people who were super interested in it, like for non-social reasons, because there certainly wasn't any social reward. It was just like, oh, this is really interesting. Like programming is fascinating in some way, right? You know, now you get a lot of people coming into it for social reasons, I guess now, because like they know that all these programmers are rich and powerful and run these big companies, or you know that at least you could get paid very well,
Yeah,
which
it's
didn't
very
used to be
stable
true.
employment.
Yeah, like that didn't, you know, when I was in high school, the job counselor would not suggest computer programmer. That wasn't on the list.
Right.
And so, you know, it was still like doctor and lawyer and stuff back then.
Yeah.
So the thing is, a lot of people get into programming who don't see that first principles fascination in the same way that used to draw people. And so then what does it mean to be programming if you don't see that? Well, it's like I'm doing the thing that programmers do. Look, I'm typing stuff into a computer and making things happen, right? And so it becomes this kind of cargo culting process where you're acting at what you understand it to be a programmer, right? And then all these things you're talking about, like, oh man, I set up a Docker container to do a this and that, and I got my thing running, and isn't that cool? And it's like, no, it's really not. It's not cool because like programmers really want to make stuff happen most of the times, and that isn't really making anything happen. It's like
No,
it's just
you
sort
could-
of wallowing in
You could
something.
come up with a justification for every one of those levels of abstraction. It's not providing nothing, but what's I think failing to be taken into account is the cost.
Well,
Yes, there is some small marginal benefit from adding a level of indirection,
yeah.
but what's the downside?
Well, and a lot of, this is going back to the earlier topic a little bit of complexity, but like a lot of what, because people will say, I get into arguments with people and they're like, oh no, Docker is amazing technology that lets you solve these problems. And I'm like, but those are just problems that we created like in the 90s and 2000s. They're not like real problems. They're not fundamentals of computers. They're just like, well, we created all these process complexities about do you have the right DLLs and like file system view and whatever. And here's a way to remedy this thing, this bad idea that we had. And so now you've layered on the bad ideas and then layered on the mostly kind of remedies for the bad, and you're just stacking more things.
Yeah.
And that's more things that people have to deal with, right? So again, back when I was in college in the 90s on workstation class computers, we would just copy programs around and run them because they were on the same operating system. They were mostly statically linked at that time. If they were dynamically linked, the DLLs were compatible, or, shared object files. These were Unix systems. And like it was fine. You didn't need a Docker container to deploy things, right? And then we somehow made a world where you need to do that. And it's like, okay, I just stay away from all of those things. So the game, okay, here's a thing where people in the video games industry are kind of culturally different from most other programmers, is I feel like the majority of the programming industry is in this mode where programming means I interoperate with the environment I almost don't know how to say it because I don't live in that culture. I'm trying to say it like in a non-strawman-y way, but it's like programming is about interfacing with the operating system and interfacing with the libraries, all the libraries I'm using and all these things. And video game people have a very different view because we grew up in a world where we had very extreme requirements.
Yeah.
And we're all competing with each other on like every pixel on the screen. And so the faster you could draw things and the better they looked, then you won, right? And that meant being very lean and it meant being very precise. And so you can't be lean and precise if you don't know your underlying substrate that you're running on. Like you can't just be like, well, on this operating system, I'm going to interface this way, and on this one, I'm going to interface that way. And I don't know what these interface libraries I'm using do. I just sort of use them. That doesn't work for us. And so our culture is to isolate ourselves from the underlying system to the greatest degree possible and to only interface begrudgingly and minimalistically and provide our own functionality for most things that we need. And so, for example, if you want to draw text on the screen, a video game person, we've got our text drawing code, whether that's a library that we're using or whether we wrote it ourselves, both things happen. It's something that we provide. It's not something we get from the OS, right? The font data, something that because we want to draw the same font everywhere. Like we don't want to query the font from the operating system and get something slightly different here versus there. And then it's like 3 pixels off and it doesn't like wrap correctly,
Right.
which is things you see all the time in like regular software, right? And so, like if you want robustness, there's just certain things that you should do that most programming culture thinks a different way than that. Yeah.
It's almost like the rest of the programming industry has been living with a mountain of excess wealth in terms of the hardware they're running on is so much more capable than they need, and no wonder they've become. If you gave £1 million to a 12-year-old and then expected them to become financially frugal, it wouldn't happen.
Yeah, but so this is true what you're saying, but then also a lot of this complexity that we're dealing with is born from decisions that were made back when computers were much more resource scarce that no longer make sense, but people still use those arguments, right? So I just talked about like, hey, pack your own font data in your program so that you can render font consistently.
Right.
People would say, oh, but we'll have 1 million copies of that font.
You can't be
And it's
sending a
like,
font over the web every time you load a web page. Surely that's too much data, right? A little
Well,
true type font.
or whatever, right?
Yeah.
That's actually a better argument. I'm thinking more of like native programs.
Oh, yeah.
But you can cache that or whatever. But so programs work better when they know what functions they're calling, right? And so there's this whole culture, again, the thing necessitating Docker and all of that is people decided, well, you don't really need to know what functions you're calling, just kind of, and then we'll swap out the dynamic libraries behind your back and it'll be fine. And it's totally not fine, right? And it's very difficult to ship robust software in that kind of scenario. Again, we're talking about native programs here. And so, well, if you were to just statically link, that problem would you wouldn't need containers, right? And there's two problems with that. One is there's too many people making this argument like, oh no, you'll have redundant copies of static libraries, which is actually solvable a different way, but people don't want to think about it. And the other one is we've just built these infrastructures that are more and more hostile to that because we made these decisions. So like on Linux, you can't really statically link. You can statically link kernel stuff, but you can't statically link user stuff because they made boneheaded decisions about that. And I mean, somebody would have to make a distro and declare that that's a legal thing, which I think a few of them have, but you then can't ship on most Linuxes. Like it's a disaster.
There's another angle that I wanted to come at this question from, which is thinking about information theory. So creating order actually requires energy versus if you burn something, it becomes disordered and things spread out. If you think about, say, life on Earth is ordered existence. The fact that we can be alive is partly due to the fact that we have an input of energy from the sun and we turn that into order. And order is then the opposite of entropy or complexity. So what actually is difficult in the universe is making things ordered, which is the opposite of complexity. But often what we think of as innovation in technology and in software is adding new features, which is, in a sense, moving away from order. If you had a nice, simple device, say take iPhone 1, which was crazy simple compared to all the other existing devices at the time. And I would argue it is more heroic and more a work of a genius to produce something with fewer features than it is to create something that's complex. And then if you watch a product through its life cycle and you see it becoming more complicated as people work on it, there's a way of thinking about that as just entropy acting upon this system. It's becoming more complicated because everything decays into chaos.
Yeah, well, that is true. It is happening all the time. That brings up a lot of topics for me, right? I mean, one is there's ways of writing code that are, less easily eroded, right? My code is less easily eroded over time as other people touch it versus more. And that's not really something that I was ever taught in school meaningfully. I don't know if anyone teaches it anywhere. But there's some kinds of code that just, as soon as people start modifying them, they just fall apart, right? And there's other kinds that have a very strong backbone and stay, right? So that's one thing. But also, I mean, again, culturally, we don't really have this idea anymore that software can be finished. And, this started happening even before the web, right? Because we just had all these bugs that everybody was dealing with and we got to patch the bugs and whatever. But then as soon as the web happened, this added a commercial incentive right? So the whole software as a service thing, which a lot of, because programming is a growing industry, it's what a lot of newer programmers think of as software, right?
Right.
Like I'm sure all the native program stuff that I just said is like seems irrelevant to like the majority of actual programmers because they just think of a program as like some JavaScript that you downloaded.
Yeah.
But the thing to realize is
there
that
is very old software that's still in common use. Like anybody who uses the terminal is using cat and ls. And
oh sure, like
potentially
your
Vim.
web browser won't function without a tremendous amount
Yeah.
of native things, right? But the thing that I wanted to say was we have this attitude of, hey man, like modern software comes through a web browser and it just works, which is farcical because it totally doesn't. But that comes from two places. One is that, again, and it's a mixed truth, which is nuanced, and you can it therefore gives you leeway to see what you want to see, and that's dangerous, right? There is legitimate convenience to somebody can type in a web address and suddenly they're using this interactive thing, right? Now, there are multiple ways of implementing that, and you could ask yourself what some of the other ones are, but let's just say that is more convenient than we had things in the past, right? But the real thing driving all this web stuff is the business reality that like, hey, before you used to be able to download software and own it and not ask us permission to run it, and then we couldn't bill you monthly for it. And now we can sit between you and the things you're going to do and like charge you a toll every time you click a button. Like it's not that bad, but essentially, right? And that is the model by which all these companies for the past, at least 15 years have been operating. And it's essentially a land grab where it's like software used to be one thing. Now we're making it another thing where we get to sit in the middle. And economists call that rent seeking, right? It's not completely rent seeking because there is some convenience provided. There are collaboration features provided and those things that are good. But you could have collaboration features on a native program installed on your own machine that talks over the internet. In fact, that's what Call of Duty is, or pick your own favorite video game. And, people talk about how amazing it is that you can like edit fields in a document collaboratively. And like, dude, in Call of Duty, 150 dudes are running around shooting at each other at 120 frames per second. Like your computer can just do a lot more than you think it is. And so using that to justify what is really a business land grab is not a good argument, I think.
I mean, it's easy to stand on the edge of society and shout at it for not being better. And people might say, but if you were in their shoes, you would understand the reasons that what you're suggesting is impossible. But making a game is pushing basically every software requirement to its greatest extreme, right? If you're having to stress the processor and the graphics card to its maximum degree whilst doing whilst doing all this complicated networking, and it's got to run on everybody's bespoke machine and they will be scrutinizing it and giving it their full attention. It's the most difficult use case of programming in most cases. And I mean, how many people total worked on The Witness as programmers? Do you reckon?
Programmers, there were, we grew the team slowly over time, but sort of at the peak, we had 4 programmers full time and 1 or 2 people who were, helping out occasionally as contractors. We had this very funny experience where once the game was mostly done, we, NVIDIA had a console called the NVIDIA Shield that they were promoting, and they wanted to put the game on there, and they were like, hey, we'll port the game. And it's, it's its own game engine, so it has its own rendering code and all this stuff. And we were like, sure, we'll give you the source code, you guys port it. And we got a license fee back from them. They ended up putting I don't want to say the actual number, but it was an integer multiple of the number of people on our entire team just to port it. And I don't know what like it's not probably not those people's entire job, or maybe it is. I don't know, but like it is a very different reality, right? Between like scrappy people in an independent company making something happen from first principles and like the business programmer culture.
But so as a contrast, right? Netflix employs 11,000 people. Zoom employs 8,000 people. Spotify, like 6 or 7,000.
Yeah.
Unity employs 5,000 odd people. They're making a game engine. You had to make a game engine as well as making the actual game.
Yeah.
Although maybe
Well,
that's an example of where Unity's game engine has to target the needs of whoever versus I assume you knew your requirements and just
Yeah,
built
it
features
is.
for it.
Yeah, it is much, much, much easier to make an engine for a specific game than it is to make one that people will want to give you money for games generally, right? That's a
Yeah.
whole different ballpark because most of that latter thing is about tools for all sorts of different things, and then somehow getting all that different data to run efficiently. Like, when you have one specific game, for that game what must be fast, what must be done well. And then as you start adding more hypothetical games, that broadens out, right? And it becomes a much more difficult problem. And so certainly, I wouldn't try to do a game engine to compete with Unity or Unreal with like 4 programmers. That's just not going to go very well. But I don't think you need a company the size of Unity, right? So all of these things. So another way that I have a fundamentally different worldview than other people with regard to programming is, again, I was programming on home computers since the age of 10, but, since college, I've been in this world of like real software, right? And it sure looks to me like if you just somehow look at the average productivity of a programmer over time, it is much, much lower today than it was in the past. And I think just in terms of like how much does somebody expect to get done in a day or a week if they sit down and program? And I think this is due in large part to a lot of the things we discussed about the complexity of the system that you have to deal with, right? Now, it's hard to substantiate that quantitatively because I haven't been measuring the average productivity of programmers and stuff. And
There
you
is
can't-
also a fundamentally unsolved issue of quantifying programmer productivity in general.
Yes.
Unless they're working on a trivial problem. If you're working for a web shop that's pumping out essentially content, you can
Yeah.
measure it, and actually those people probably are producing at a reasonable tick. But people who are doing something innovative can't be measured, and most of them aren't very good at it.
Yeah, and
So you
there are objective measurements like lines of code, and those tell you something, but I don't think that most code today actually does anything. So if you generate
right.
50,000 lines of code in a year that doesn't really produce net benefit, like
Yeah.
it's not good, right?
Well, plus the lines of code you're adding are adding complexity, probably adding bugs. So it's possible that somebody who has a negative line of code count is actually providing the most value.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. That's a well-known phenomenon, right? In programming, is the dude who goes in and deletes a bunch of things and everything works better.
The best
Yeah.
code I've ever written was when I realized the code didn't need writing. Like no code never breaks.
Yes, that's true. That is, I wish they taught that in school.
Yeah.
But so then this has a compounding effect, right? Because if programmers are less efficient, you need more of them to do the same thing. But then because more is nonlinear, you need more and more to do the same thing. And so then you get this explosive growth in company sizes, right?
Yeah.
Now, in fact, I think both of the major factors in programmer productivity going down we've mentioned. One is just the complexity you have to deal with and like all the terrible stuff. The other one is, again, because I think as the field grew and people got into it more for money or social validation or excitement, you would expect those people on average to be not as good as the people who were like super hyped about it and like dedicating their life to programming or whatever. Those people are going to be way better. And so I think just from the fact of a growing field, even if software were not decaying in quality, you would see a decline in average productivity, right? And so those combined with the fact that you have a super linear growth in number of people required to do things, as team sizes grow, that's how you get to these large company sizes that you mentioned. I think, so I've been complaining about these large company sizes in speeches for a long time. Elon Musk finally went in and like fired the vast majority of Twitter, and it's fine. So what were all those people doing?
Yeah, it's like if there was a battle going on, back in the days of hand-to-hand combat, the front row are risking their lives and killing the enemy, but you go 1 or 2 rows back and there's just guys standing around waiting for their turn. I think it's the same thing. If you talk to people who work at large companies who are doing the work, they're well aware that most of the divisions aren't doing anything that contributes to the value of the company.
Yeah.
But everybody's incentivized to show that they're maybe working on the 8-year out strategy or...
Yeah, I mean, if you ask people, they'll surely tell you that what they're doing is super important, right? Everybody's doing something super important.
Yeah.
But so the thing at Twitter, I don't think is an anomaly. I think that all of these companies are overstaffed by... I think Twitter is a simpler product than most, right? Like Google has a lot of things going on that are more complicated, right? But nevertheless, it is similarly overstaffed, just the factor by which it's overstaffed is not quite as high as Twitter, right? And the thing is, we were in this economic environment where there was all this free money, the valuation of the so-called technology companies was very high and rising over time. They could give out these huge stock options to all their employees. They could compete with each other by, paying people vast amounts of money to do very little work, right? And that economic environment seems to have come to an end. It remains to be seen exactly what the next environment is, right? And it may be like the previous one, but mitigated, or it might be like a complete disaster or whatever. But these large team sizes were fueled by the fact that there's basically free money falling out of the sky for these companies, right? And so they were not subject to normal economic pressures, right? A normal company that makes things cares about how much it costs to create the product because they can sell that product for a certain price. So the less it costs to create, the better they do, right? And if they don't do well enough, they go out of business, right? So for most of these companies, the cost to create the product is kind of irrelevant because they're just getting all this money coming in because they won whatever local turf war there was for a certain business model on the internet. Now they own that business model or they're their primary competitor. And that's just worth a certain amount of money, and you can hire however many people you could afford to pay at that budget level, right? And the stock market likes growth, right? So if you hire more people, you're growing. You can make those people generate, hopefully generate additional revenue in some way. It's different if they're programmers versus sales people or account reps or whatever. But anyway, the point being that
you could look at
this
it.
was not driven by classical logic around product development, right? And so now, if we're in a regime where people start to care how much the product costs, then companies like Facebook, let's say, and whoever are incentivized to look at Twitter and say, wait, if they can do what they're doing with a seventh the number of people, and now we're groaning under the cost of paying all these people, don't we want to think about that too, right? And so you may see much more of a shift toward downsizing than people expect, and that actually would be really. There's a lot of people in college right now who expect to graduate and get a job programming, and it might be really hard.
Huh.
Yeah.
You could look at it as, rather than we are a company with a product or a number of products and we're doing whatever it takes to produce more or better product to make money, but more like the most valuable resource on earth is anybody with any remote technical expertise or even interest. We just want to collect them. We don't really care if they're being productive, because for the future health of our company, we just want to have more than anybody else in our arsenal. And when a problem comes along, we can just draw from the ranks of our a vast number of people.
Well, there's one thing that I hear a lot that people believe, which is that it's competitive hiring, right? So if you hire somebody, you deny your competitors the opportunity to hire that person. I think that's a little bit true, but it doesn't really make that much sense to me at scale. Like it makes perfect sense to me for senior people who are like the stars, but I don't think that logic plays out at the scale of these companies exactly. But what I do think is happening is, especially so most of these companies are either public or they're on this venture capital track where they have to show growth. In both of those cases, you want to show exponential growth over time, right? And so what these CEOs are doing all the time is trying to juice the growth number, right? Mm-hmm. And, it sure feels like not having enough people to do all sorts of things would constrain growth. And so like you never want to be constrained by how many people you can allocate to different places, because, if your growth percentage is like, 0.25 less than you wanted it to be, that's a huge difference. And so I think that's really what drives a lot of this. Also, there's just internal incentives that are perverse, right? So a company as a unit may want to produce something as efficiently as possible, but that's composed of different groups that have managers. Those managers have career prospects where they feel better about themselves and look better to other people the more people that they preside over, right? Mm-hmm. And so every group actually wants to grow and get a bigger budget for itself and have the manager manage more people, even though in theory the company as a whole would want to stay smaller, except that that's not true for these particular companies, right? But like I said, it may become true.
Well, but if you, so I mentioned Spotify has close to 7,000 employees. I reckon if you took 7 people, so 0.1% of the number of people at the company, if you had 7 genuinely motivated people and a year, you could make a feature-for-feature replacement from scratch for Spotify. It might not even take 7 people. So you have to have some explanation for the size of the company other than it's the best solution to the problem that they have. Because they could make a new Spotify every year and only replace it if it's better when it gets to it. What's the point in having such a large number of people? But as you mentioned, one aspect here is that the decisions are being made by humans, and those humans have individual incentives, and the incentives for managers push them to make a very particular type of behavior. So if you're a manager, your interests is just to what are the incentives of a manager? You want to be risk averse, so you're going to be hedging a lot.
Well, I mean, there are some positive. We can talk about the alignment of the incentives of the manager with the overall goals of the company, right? And some things are correctly aligned. Like if your project is successful, that's good for the company, it's good for you, right? But how do you go about making your project successful? You could be very, very smart and very, very diligent and put a lot of energy into it and make correct decisions at all times. Those things are difficult, right? Or you could avoid risk. That's easy. Anyone can avoid risk, right? You don't need any special talent to avoid risk. And so you see that a lot more. even though sometimes a correctly chosen risk is very, very valuable, right?
Versus the original creation is done by people with quite different personality types. If you're an entrepreneur, you aren't interested in managing things. You want to create. So you often see a legacy industry that is obviously about to die, absolutely unable to pivot or try anything new to get into whatever's going to replace it, because the people who are now in charge don't have the spirit that made them successful in their existing industry, right? So when things move, it's generally, you see small upstarts, people who are not encumbered, but also people who are just naturally different in their makeup, who are able to pivot into those new problems.
Yeah, I do want to say, like, running a company is not easy, right? It's actually very difficult to do well, and so I don't think this should be said to like denigrate the people who do that, because it's an important and useful thing, and without which, you know, if you have somebody who has cool ideas and they do it in the beginning until it turns into something, and then, you know, and then it blows up when they leave 100% of the time, then we would find it very difficult as humanity to like get bigger things done, right? And so our ability to get bigger things done is actually very valuable, but I think all the more so that's important why we need to look at these pathologies being caused by the way, like the current system that we have set up and the current incentives, and try to fix some of them, right?
Do you think the current systems that we have been set up by deliberate choices, or is there an inevitability about the way society ends up being organized? Is it possible to make substantial changes to the entire way the human race operates on large scales?
I mean, I'm a game designer, and game designers design rewards and penalties and incentives and things to encourage certain types of behavior, and that actually works very well in video games.
Yep.
So I definitely am a believer that you can create better or worse environments for people, and you'll have radically better or worse outcomes based on that. And, you know, I think that's true. Here in the United States, where we live, we've just gone through a period where, you know, there were some world scale issues for a couple years that a lot of people were concerned about, and different states in the US had very different methods of handling this. And I moved from a state that was handling it one way to one that was handling it a different way that I liked more. So, you know, both at a state level, state just meaning governmental entity in this case, things can be done. And at an individual level, if you're living in a sufficiently free society, you are able to act on that as well. And I appreciate the ability to do this. Well, that's the thing, is like preserving that ability for competition so that there isn't, you know, if you live in a place where you are not free to travel and you are not free to choose circumstances of your life, then essentially there's a very hard monopoly on these kind of decisions, right? Whereas if you're able to move and you're able to make these kind of choices, then there are local monopolies, and you may not like having to leave a certain place because you like certain things about this place, but at least you can make that choice. And hopefully we don't lose that, although, you know, the world today in terms of like what is in the Overton window of political discourse is unrecognizable to like childhood version of me. And so we might lose that ability really fast, is all I can say. Like, I've seen us lose other things really fast. like within a matter of like seemingly in 4 years going from something seeming undoubtable and incontrovertible to being like a highly controversial thing that will paint you as a heretic if you speak about it in the wrong way. Like, it's
Yeah.
nuts, dude.
Yeah. So COVID's an interesting example because as it to in the context of is it how different can societies operate? Because it seemed like more or less the whole planet acted in a very similar way. I mean, there was a lot of focus on the differences, but actually, given the stimulus and the response, I think everywhere sort of acted almost in lockstep. And yeah, there was some state-to-state variation, but there weren't any states that didn't have a lockdown of any description. And so the most free state in America looks quite similar to the China in one degree. Despite us thinking of them as completely different systems, there was this strange similarity in how everybody acted.
I don't know. There's a similarity. So in the U.S., depending on, again, what state you're talking about, there's, what is the rhetoric coming from the government about what should be happening versus like what people are actually doing, right? And there are certainly a bunch of places in the U.S. where like nobody ever did any kind of lockdown at all, even though it was stated that that's what you should be doing.
Okay.
But yeah, like it is, the point is taken that, and I've been thinking about this lately, was a remarkable lack of diversity in terms of even how to think about how to approach this.
Yeah.
Right. As far as we could see from what was publicly visible
Right.
to someone like me, there's a little bit. And then every once in a while, when you see some diversity in thinking about this, it gets attacked. Right. On the other hand, like it's a really, really important issue. So shouldn't you not be overconfident that you know the right answer, right?
Yeah.
Because what if you are wrong? Like, don't you need, don't you need to be thinking about scenarios? And so, well, this is true in software as well. Like, I think it's very observable that for some reason, like the USA has mostly set the tone for what happens in software, and then other people just kind of copy it, again, to the extent of what's observable. And we really don't see other places in the world having their own completely separate take on software. We just see, sometimes they try to copy the business success, like, oh, we're going to make our own local Silicon Valley or whatever. But people's idea of how to do that is we're going to do what they are doing over here, right?
Yeah, I'd argue that there's a significant difference in the way a team will tackle a problem if you hire, say, a local US or a UK team versus you outsource the problem to, India, Vietnam, somewhere like that. Their approach is much more, we're going to have lots of people who are low skilled. We'll have very low expectations for what they can achieve. We won't really train them up. We won't give them good resources, and they will just produce low quality but low price code. You hire a small team of imaginative, creative people, and you give them lots of resources and a luxurious environment to work in, and then they come up with this kind of concise, accurate code that does what it. Whether that.
When was the last time that actually happened? Yeah,
but at least that's the American model that's the way that Western companies sell their software expertise.
Oh, sure. And the whole outsourcing of software thing has been going on since the 80s at least, probably before that, but I don't know much about before that. and this was always the dynamic, right? I suspect that quality has gone down both here and overseas as quantity has gone up, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
And so what you get from an average, Twitter programmer today is probably what you got from an outsourced programmer in the 90s or something.
Whether the outsourcing has also gone down, I don't know. But perhaps there's just regression to the mean.
Well, some of it is hard to observe, right? Because what happens is you pay a company, it's sort of the company's job to keep their thing together and deliver you something that you can use somehow, right? And so there's managers there fighting fires and deciding who is too low skill that they can't get anything out of them that's useful and whatever. And so you often don't necessarily have visibility into how many people are working on the thing or what they're doing and stuff. And so I don't know. I certainly, so in games, even companies as small as ours, in fact, maybe because it's small, we work with other companies once in a while. We contract out things that we need to do. Usually not exactly the kind of outsourcing that we're talking about, usually to somebody that's also a relatively small company in the US or Europe or somewhere who's theoretically this high quality thing. Very often the results, even with that, are not high quality because it's not their project. They don't exactly care. They don't have all the context about it. They don't know.
Yeah.
They've got 7 projects that they're doing. They're making money from all of them. If yours doesn't go that well, if they overbill you and you don't work that hard on it,
Well, it might take a few days to think about the problem and decide the best approach. It's very difficult to bill people on having made the right decision when you could just arbitrarily pick a direction and go for it. And
I mean, if that works in terms of producing an actual thing in the end, then sure. But
well, if you care about the outcome, so if I was going to live with the results of that decision myself and live or die on the quality of the code, I would 100% of the time advocate for sit and think about the problem, make the right decision. But if your personal incentive says we're going to be paid and gone long before the results of our decision is discovered, why would I make my life difficult by arguing that I've been productive because of my thinking time when I could just hand in code and enjoy my weekend?
Yeah, absolutely.
So something that I've heard you comment on in the past in the realm of game design is how often you hear people talk about the games they've made and they don't appear to understand why the thing that they've built is good.
Surprisingly often that happens. Yeah.
I don't think this is limited to games. I actually think artists in general often don't know why the thing that they've made is good. It's almost this death of the author idea, right? The person who was responsible for making the thing isn't privileged in their observation of it when they've finished, and they may be as intangible for them as for anybody else. Especially when you can stumble upon gold, and that gold is the quality of it is in the interaction between elements, right?
I'm not that big of a fan of the death of the author idea because it appears to me to be a very obvious ploy to say, I'm a graduate student who wants to write research papers, and what I have to say about this thing is just as legitimate as what the author had to say.
Right.
Therefore, my research or my paper is important and good, right?
Uh-huh.
So I think that's where that came from. But there are some things about it that are maybe not that surprising. Okay, there's always luck, right? So sometimes people can just luck into something, and then they don't luck into that again. And that's not too surprising. But Sometimes there's things, it really doesn't seem like luck. It really seems like this thing was really good. And then people don't get it. And maybe that's not that surprising either, because I wish I could make things faster, but, I tend to work on things hard for a long time. And one aspect of that is it gives your unconscious mind time to just like look at things, and then you have ideas that are good. Like that's just how that works.
Yeah.
And you can't really schedule it. You can't demand to have a good idea right now. In fact, that's often counterproductive. But so it is not that hard for me to imagine going through a phase where that process is working very well. And then for some reason I screw it up or it stops happening and like the good ideas just don't come anymore. And maybe if I don't even visualize that as an interaction between my unconscious and conscious mind, if I just am like, well, I had all these good ideas and I don't know what that, I just have good ideas sometimes, whatever. And then I could see that as happening, but it's complicated. And I wouldn't pretend to understand it.
Like a musician could spend years learning music theory and understanding why this chord followed by this chord has that emotional effect. But the only point of music theory is to try to understand the way that an untrained brain receives music in the first place. So you could write music without understanding any music theory. You just press notes until it pleases your own brain and release it and other people enjoy it. And if you went and talked to them and said, why is your music good? They may not have even heard of the idea of a chord. They just press buttons and they like it. And it's beyond their grasp conceptually. As an artist, they can, versus somebody else may be able to introspect and say, well, this is my process and it's repeatable and I'm sort of pulling the strings behind the scenes, so I have this understanding of my own art. But I think it's very possible that somebody can create something without the slightest idea of why the thing works, and that might be the most frustrating thing as an artist ever, to be unaware of their own process. But I was going to link this back to the question of how society is organized, in that could it be similarly the case that the way that the world operates is not truly known by anybody? Like we think of, these are the problems, this is how it should be fixed, but it's not the case that anybody thinks that this would have been, nobody said, I reckon this will be a good way to set up the world. This set of incentives will produce results. It's much more of an evolutionary thing of, well, this was enough of aligned incentives for this civilization to flourish. And it's almost unchangeable. You're stuck with the set of systems that you've got, even though you now can see the problems. It's baked in stone.
Yeah, I would be I don't think it is very easy to know. Even just say today, let's say I want to look at the society that I live in and see why it works or doesn't work. It is very, very hard to even know what are all the systems at play here that are affecting things and that are tying together to make whatever happens happen. It's like, it seems basically impossible. And so, then doing this in a way where you do some analysis and then come up with modifications and then try to deploy that modified society. I don't see that as really even possible. Which is not to say that you can't improve things or that you can't I don't know. I'm thinking
But
of other
it
things to
could
say, but
be.
they're redundant.
Well,
So,
so this is the unknown from my perspective. It could be that there are a group of people in powerful positions who know more than we do, and they know how the
that is
systems
absolutely
work,
true. Yeah.
and that actually it's all very deliberately planned. Sure, okay, I'll accept. Definitely,
Yeah.
there's people who know more than me,
Yeah.
but do the people who are the elite, the most in charge people of all, do they know how all the systems work intricately, or are they guessing to a large degree?
They don't even know what all the systems are, right?
Okay.
Okay. So,
How do we
we'll
know?
take
How
a
do we
very,
know?
they just don't.
Okay.
It's not possible. But, when it comes, so when you're at a very simplistic level, right? Absolutely, there are people who know more. So to take an example that's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, right? There's this war happening in Ukraine,
Uh-huh.
and almost everything you hear in public about it is propaganda that is easily
Yeah.
not true. And how do you know that? You know that because if you actually look up the history of what's happened that led up to this, almost none of what's being said makes any sense relative to that history, right?
Uh-huh.
Like it doesn't fit into the story. And so on the other hand, probably, now I'm not actually sure about this, but probably the majority of the people involved in prosecuting the war in Ukraine, like executing it and making it happen, probably do know why it's happening and all these things, right? And so there is definitely a difference between what the public knows, what I know about Ukraine, and what someone knows, right? For sure, absolutely. And that's true at multiple levels. Like even if there wasn't a large scale goal kind of difference, right? Even if that was like the same or that was being truthfully communicated, there's just all sorts of things in reality about like when you're there on the ground and you have to make all sorts of things work, like the decisions that you make are informed by all this practical experience that's not even possible to communicate to other people, even if you were going to try. Like imagine somebody who spends 30 years getting good at military logistics and they're like, no, I'm shipping these things this way and this over here and that over there. And you're like, well, why? And the dude's like, it's going to take me a month to explain this to you. Do you really want? Right. And so there's a degree to which things can't be communicated and a degree to which things won't be communicated. And those are separate and they operate at different levels. But also, neither of those people knows everything that's at play in the world. And so there's nobody, there's nobody who can really orchestrate things long term because you just don't know what's happening right now. And if you don't know what's happening right now, you can't predict into the future, like hardly at all, except in local areas for short periods of time.
I've heard it said that, and I don't know how true this is, we've got some idea of the internal workings of the Russian regime, but the CCP is pretty much opaque. Like there's little information that actually gets out of China. But I don't know if that's true. Maybe that's just the story that's being broadcast from the US.
I mean, there are, lots of, minutes of CCP meetings that people can go and read. Now, they're usually not translated, but you can go have somebody translate them.
It.
They may or may not be truthful or sanitized to a certain degree, but you can certainly have a much better picture. So, again, going back to the Russia thing for a second, like for at least the past couple decades, like Vladimir Putin does interviews all the time. Like, and he's very candid about speaking in these, and who knows when he's telling the truth and when he's not, but it seems like he's pretty straightforward most of the time. And you can go watch these, but like almost nobody in the US has ever seen these because it's not, it is not,
The things
it's just
you're
not
saying
part
are,
of what we do. We don't want to have the accurate picture of what this guy is saying about what he's doing. And I mean, even predating Ukraine stuff. I mean, go back to like when everybody was saying Trump-Russia collusion or whatever. And it's like, well, what does Russia actually think? And you could find out, but nobody's interested in really finding out. So I do think this is just something we're not that interested in. Like if you look at the function of all these things, like, okay, I'm some random dude arguing on Twitter about Ukraine or Taiwan or something. I have no impact on these things whatsoever, right? What I say on Twitter has no, and maybe from a state level heuristic way of trying to drive things, having a large number of people have a certain attitude helps you do things, right? But I'm cooperating with that because I gain some benefit from it somehow. Like it gives me a way to get emotionally riled up and to form, you could call it weak social bonds or mob dynamics or however you want to look at it, right? But like evolutionarily speaking, it sure looks like at certain times these things become very important, right? When resources are scarce or you're in the middle of a very violent conflict or something, people's attitude towards each other or the general social bearing from one person to another has a great deal of influence on who comes out of that alive, right? And so there's a lot of evolutionary pressure on that. And so we as human beings seem to look for excuses to engage in this thing. And the content of the excuse doesn't seem to matter very much, right? If it wasn't this thing, it would be that thing. And if it would be the current thing, whatever the current thing is this week. And that's why the current thing is a thing, is because we derive some kind of perceived, now actually we're probably being manipulated and there's a net exploitation, but we perceive that there's a benefit, even though, again, our conscious brains probably don't understand this, right? But you have a lot of evolutionary pressure to have certain responses to certain kinds of things, and you'll look for opportunities to do that, right? And I think that that's also why, so the stories about these things don't make that much sense, right? Again, especially the USA, Ukraine, Russia, Europe story it's turned into. It's like the Ukraine cinematic universe now. People keep showing up in it. And
yeah, there's superheroes who can shoot down endless people in the sky, and
like none of it makes any sense. But we don't want it to. We don't need it to in order to do what we're trying to do with it from day to day as human beings. COVID, same thing. Very serious issue. Like people are getting this disease, right? That's not good. But sorry, what I was about to say reminded me of a song that I used to listen to, and it's a very off-color song. So I'm not going to use it as a reference. I thought maybe, but like we need to do our little ego-based emotional thing more than we need to solve a global pandemic. You know what I mean?
Well, our brain is hacked by the scale of the global problem into assuming that it should be the priority of our lives. I guess it's sensible if you see really, something in front of your eyes.
That's an excuse, though, right? Like we're looking for an excuse for things to be that urgent, because that gives us license to be as emotional as we want about it and as extreme and judgmental as we want about it. If everybody's like, yeah, this thing's not important, then I can't really judge you very harshly based on this thing. But if it's like a world shattering thing,
Right.
then you're either infinitely good or infinitely bad, depending on your response to this thing.
But if we can connect our emotions to things that we can do, we can be very motivated and achieve things that affect the world in a positive way. Unfortunately, most people seem to have convinced themselves that it is not only justified but sort of morally required for them to spend a significant amount of time every day thinking and getting emotionally exercised about things over which they can never have any influence whatsoever. And I don't know how this could ever be broken. I feel like this is just, we're stuck as a species in this mode of everybody's. I guess say every month you've got a certain amount of empathy tokens. You can put amount of effort towards whatever you care about, and if you spend them all on expressing opinions into the void towards social media, and you then don't have any left for the people who your friends and family who have actual problems, then you're achieving nothing, and the cost is everything.
Yeah, I used to, going back to around 2008, 2009, I was unpopular among certain people in the video games industry because I would go give these speeches about how certain designs of games were unethical because they were about psychologically manipulating people and so forth. But what is now happening on social media is like way worse than what any of these games do, because I do think these platforms thrive off this. They won't, again, if you go ask the engineers who make Twitter happen or something, they'll say, oh, there's a little bit of that, but it's a net good because blah, blah, blah. And it's like, really? And also, are you really trying to, mitigate some of these negative manipulations? Because you could imagine tuning a communications platform to attempt to disincentivize this kind of manipulation of people's emotions and just incentivize clear, thoughtful, nuanced communication. And nobody really wants to do that because it reduces traffic, right? Mm-hmm. And there you go. And people won't admit that that's really what's happening.
Yeah, I don't know to what degree the algorithms, say the YouTube recommendation algorithm or the Twitter trending, that presumably...
Can I rant for a second?
Please.
Let me push pause. So the word, since we're talking about society, all right?
Yeah.
The word algorithm is a propaganda word.
Yeah.
Being used to manipulate people, okay?
Yeah.
What is an algorithm? Again, for non-technical people, you don't care, but let's just lay it out. An algorithm is a method of solving a well-defined problem in a mathematical-like way for which there is a correct answer that can be verified correct. And the algorithm can be verified correct as a thing that produces the correct answer. That is not what any of this stuff is that people call algorithms on YouTube and Facebook. What it instead is like heuristics, which is a fancy multi-syllable word. It's like arbitrary choices, right? If you program, it's like a boatload of if statements.
It's more like the Coke secret formula, right? It's a flavor.
Yes. And so calling these things algorithms, I think, both lends them more respectability than they deserve, but also removes the asking of certain kinds of questions about them that I think people should be asking. Do you remember? So back before things got so insane with all of social media, I think YouTube was one of the first platforms that people were putting pressure on, because there were all these articles that were like, I started with such and such a video, and I was able to click on links, and eventually I was watching Nazis.
Yes, the
right?
YouTube is radicalizing
yes.
people kind of.
And this was used to say that the algorithm, right, which again is a heuristic or whatever, was incredibly biased or doing bad things or whatever. And this was obviously untrue. Like, if you imagine the simplest possible actual algorithm, right, which is like all your videos are points in space, and you pick the one you just watched, and draw a circle around it, right? It's like, yeah, there's some video to the east of that thing. And if you keep walking east, you'll get to the eastern boundary of the space. Like, that's a completely unbiased algorithm, and you can do. So what these people were really calling for is you should not have
an easterly direction.
You should not be able to walk east. And it was never stated such a, now people just say that, right? Before, 5, 6, 8 years ago, this was not sayable, and now it is sayable. And that's scary, I think.
The idea being, at first, or at least the way it was talked about, at first, let's prevent these accidental side effects of the systems that we've set up, which are pushing people in a direction we don't like. And now it is, let's use the systems that we have as tools to push people to, not left and right politically, right, but the direction east and west is better. We want people to go west. Let's make the systems push them to the west, so it's impossible for anybody to go east, no matter how unique they are.
I think YouTube just got crushed under that. I don't know what it was, or maybe it was driven internally like Twitter, but YouTube is very, very dead to me now compared to how, like, it used to be I would go on YouTube and I would see new stuff to watch that I didn't know about and all that. And now it doesn't recommend anything to me except things that I'm subscribed to or that I've already watched, or very, very rarely there's something very, very similar to what I've already seen. But it's so clamped down that there's no motion at all. And I don't watch as much YouTube as I otherwise would, because I just go on the page and there's all this stuff that I don't like. You're re-showing me all the things I decided not to watch every time I go to YouTube, right?
Right.
The fact that I did not watch them is, and the problem is YouTube just doesn't have sufficient competition to, they just have the de facto monopoly regardless of how bad their thing is. Now, of course, over time it's bad, and they'll lose their position eventually because of this, but it takes a long time for those things to happen.
I wonder, though, if the Musk takeover of Twitter is interesting because the direction that these platforms move feels glacially slow and also inevitable in a certain direction. But actually, with somebody in charge who's prepared to actually set a direction, they can move quickly and they can go in a different direction. So it's almost it's the default for companies, and maybe we go back to the managerial idea that there's a type of behavior that is incentivized for people who are just looking after their career, and the aggregate effect of all these decisions pushes inevitably in one way. But you can have somebody who, like Steve Jobs, coming back into Apple and saying, right, we're going to do something radically different. And maybe the takeover of Twitter is similar. Suddenly you see more features going onto that platform in the last 3 weeks than there have been in the last 3 years.
Oh, yeah. Still not very many, by the way, but,
True.
I imagine they have a huge technical mess to clean up. So it would be very hard for a while to actually do good things on the platform. But yeah, I mean, I don't remember how many engineers they have at this point. I mean, they're over 1,000 employees still, right? I don't know, over 2,000, something like that. But I don't know Twitter, the breakdown of engineers versus other people. But
I also wonder whether there's people being brought over from Musk's other companies. Like, if I was him, I'd say, right, let's take a dozen people away from, doing car AI code for a second.
I'm not that impressed by the software that runs on a Tesla. I don't know about the AI stuff. I've met a couple of the guys who were involved with that in the past, and they seem like smart guys. But dude, when I use the actual user interface stuff on a Tesla, I'm not impressed by it at all.
I haven't followed it that closely. I I wasn't holding that company up as the pinnacle of software engineering so much as just
no, but I understand
a
the
trusted
idea.
inner circle, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have no visibility into that process, so it's hard to say.
I mean, George Hotz, wasn't it, the guy who famously coded single-handedly?
Yeah, I've met George a few times. I've
Have
hung
you?
out with him a couple times. Yeah.
And actually, he did end up working in Twitter, at least briefly, didn't he?
Well, I think he is starting now or like next week or
Okay.
something. He's doing a 12-year or a 12-week
12-week internship.
internship, which is very funny, but it's kind of a good idea. Like I almost am like, dude, you've got this other company to run. What are you doing? But I also understand wanting a bit of a break from a thing and being able to go to another thing. I'm sure part of what he's thinking is I want to see how things operate over here and make my own judgments about what I like and don't like, and then bring it back, to my own thing. So I'll be interested to see what happens there for sure.
But I think there's certain things you can only do. Well, like you know the auteur theory of filmmaking. That
Yes.
You can only make good art with an individual in the driving seat making those creative decisions. You can't build a good movie by committee. I mean, I remember kind of being puzzled about this as a teenager, thinking, the studio is spending millions of pounds making this movie, and it's panned critically and doesn't make its money back because of a script issue. Why can't you throw people at the script problem in the same ways you do in the visual effects, post-production phase of the movie?
Yeah. Well, the script is easily the cheapest part of a movie, right?
Right.
Like how
You
hard
get
is
one
it?
person for a year?
If that. I mean, but the way I have some friends who are much more into movies than me. I don't know that much about it, but my perception about movies is just that culturally, everything in a movie is thought of in a very shallow surface way, right? So to use almost a metaphor, right? The costumes that look really good on the screen are like, you couldn't actually wear them because they would fall apart in one day, right? They're like pinned together
Yes.
and whatever. And they don't have a back half the time if you're only
Yeah,
shooting
yeah.
the people from the front and all this stuff. And I think they think of scripts the same way. They think of them as like, we need this scene, or we want to do this thing here, and then we need to do this thing here. And the job of the script is to fill in those opportunities for us. And it's not about thinking about the volume inside the script that helps it hold together and make sense. It's like, we need this action scene and this funny joke and whatever. And that just leads to
Yeah.
what we see today,
if you're the
right?
senior executive of a movie company, and you say, let's cut the action scene from the last third of the movie, and then the movie tanks, you're going to lose your job.
Sure.
But if you say, we're going to rush the scriptwriter, and the result is that the script loses its internal coherence, and then the script is, and then the movie is panned, I don't think the same consequences apply. It's kind of immeasurable. In the same way as I was talking about in a software project, you want to take a couple of extra days to make the correct decision, but you can't quantify, because you're not going to split the universe in two and run the experiment of each of your decisions to discover the true effects. It's the same thing with the movie. Some movies become classics because, like you were saying about your art, you spend enough time as an author, as an auteur, caring about the world and the creative decisions, and that results in something that's just greater than the sum of its parts. But somebody from a managerial perspective, they can't measure it. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Yeah. I mean, clearly that dynamic is at work. But like I said, I don't have much direct experience in that industry, and so
Yeah.
I'm sure that if you bring a movie person on, they'll tell you all sorts of reasons why it is the way it is that I don't know, and a lot of those will be excuses that are not true, but some of them will be true, right? And that's sort of the challenge that we have, is that there's all these outcomes that we don't like that are motivated by partial truths, right? And getting in there and like pulling apart the part that is true and necessary from the part that is just a story we tell ourselves is requires constant vigilance and is very difficult.
Talking of the algorithms that are used to steer users of social media platforms, can we talk a bit about the recent developments in AI and their potential? So we've seen in the last couple of years, I think the most startling example of this for me is that you can put in text, a short sentence, into an AI, and in almost no time at all, it produces an image of startling quality. I would say I've not had a moment with technology like this for a long time where I just can't believe that this is possible. It feels like it must be some kind of a trick. Like how can we have made something that feels as magical as this? So, okay, that's often the reaction to new technologies, and then we kind of settle down the excitement a bit and think, what's the actual effect of this on human society? So, when you're thinking about all the new tools that have just come on the scene and probably not yet really impacted the arts, are you excited about new possibilities? What are the downsides? How do you feel about AI right now?
I just don't know where it's going to go. Like, so two things are simultaneously true about this one right now, right? One, it's very impressive, and we're doing things with these techniques that, going back even 6 years ago, I told you would not have been possible today remotely, right? If anything, we would have that capability 50 years from now or whatever. And so there's been a startling amount of progress in a short amount of time. At the same time, it isn't exactly what people think it is. Like, it's not, we're doing a certain amount of like filling in with our own minds of what we see. And so, for example, with the image thing, on the one hand, yeah, it's super impressive that we're able to make things that generate these images. At the same time, if you kind of know what to look for, you can start looking at these images and see that they lack a certain kind of internal
Coherence.
consistency. Yeah, that like a real artist would produce. And so it's like, it doesn't really know what's in the image exactly, right? But it does, but it doesn't. And so I'm not saying that, a lot of people use that kind of statement to like discount that this is an important thing or whatever. I don't think so, because we're at a certain step in time. What is the next step, right? Maybe it involves addressing that kind of issue. Who knows? So if we've made startling progress already, it's not that hard to imagine more startling progress in the next 5 years. And where does that end you, right?
So one of the problems in game design that I've heard you talk a lot about is the inherent challenge of interactivity, and the fact that, say one way of looking at this, I guess, is the longer you play a game, the more decisions that the player has made has branched outwards and produced just an unmanageable amount of potential paths for a designer to contemplate. So if you're wanting to have a curated experience, you either have to limit the interactivity, which makes it less of a game, or you limit the artistic expression. And so it feels like as as an artist working with an interactive medium, there's this inherent tension.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. Like what you just said there at the end, I don't agree with.
Okay.
There are certain modes of artistic expression, like storytelling, for which this is true. But there's like part of what's interesting about working in games right now is we are still finding new kinds of artistic expression that people didn't have before. And like those don't necessarily become weakened with the increase in interactivity. In fact, they can become strengthened. And so the problem is just when people do too much pretending like they're in movies or pretending like they're writing a novel, but this is a game. And that produces this kind of problem. But if you're more like, I'm creating moods and settings, or one of the things we do in the games that we're working on right now that's probably hard to explain to people, but we're working on a puzzle game where you set up the elements, and it's a puzzle that you try and solve, but in doing so, you observe and gain an appreciation for the way things were set up, and that is expressive. In a different, it's kind of like poetry almost, where you appreciate the, certain aspects of the sound and texture of what you're reading. It's like that, but actually pretty different too. And so that's hard. It's harder to discover that kind of thing than it is to just write a story like it's a movie. And so, and also a lot of people in the games industry are making a huge amount of money from writing stories like they're movies and shoving them into a game. But
yes,
but that doesn't make it like, high art, right?
It's a bit like chess boxing, isn't it? The way some games operate. It's like just two different experiences that alternate.
I only learned about chess boxing a couple of weeks ago, and it seems absurd. But
in a way, it's the same type of experiential design that we've been using in, cutscene followed by first-person shooter followed by cutscene is quite similar as a form of entertainment. But we've been limited in as game designers in having to, I guess, pre-bake all of the interactions for the player, and that you can set up the boundaries of play, but you can't make artistic decisions on the fly. I've been wondering recently whether there's the possibility of building AI that can have an artistic steer. So to use the text to image AI as a kind of example, suppose you wanted to have let's just, to make it simple, let's assume you just want an image of an NPC that you've run into. You can now theoretically set up a bunch of keywords as the game designer that you never reveal, but that's your input. You then let the player make some decisions and they add keywords, and what comes out is the product of these in a way that wasn't previously possible without the neural networks and the deep learning and so on. That's a very surface level version of this. You could imagine it producing geometry, making shaders. It could design the layout of a city so that the path you take through it is based on the path you took through a city 4 hours ago. So are we going to see a new type of game design where the experience is much less tightly controlled, but much more reactive to the player? Is this an exciting new world of games?
I'm not sure, right? And to explain why, I'll go back to, I'll dial back, let's say 15 to 20 years. If you went to games industry conferences, games were still getting more impressive in terms of graphics very quickly. Today, game graphics get a little bit better over time, but it's a very slow advancement, right? But graphics were getting better rapidly, physics was getting better rapidly. GPUs were starting to be used widely, and so you were getting a big jump from that. And so there was all this discussion about like, oh, or certain people would talk about it like, we're going to reach this holy grail of simulating reality, right? And my friend Frank Lance actually gave a speech at one of these conferences. It was a short speech, like 5 minutes, but he basically shot down this idea because the job of a game is not really to simulate reality. It's to give you an experience that is not reality. And the way that it is different from reality is what makes it valuable as a game, right? Like, and this is true of all human modes of expression. So one of the analogies he used is that the reason language is valuable is that it's different from the thing, right? And that's why in hunter-gatherer days, your friend could shout, "Watch out, there's a bear," and that's useful, right? The word bear would not be better if it had teeth and could kill you, because then if your friend shouts, "Watch out, there's a bear," you would die.
Spawned another one.
Right? Yes. So,
Yeah.
so that, in chess, you're not actually murdering a bunch of foot soldiers, and that's good, right? And so to bring that forward to today, we already have some games that have tried this thing a little bit. Like there's, in the early days of, I think it might have even been GPT-2 or something, there was this like AI dungeon thing that was kind of a real game. And it's like, it's not a game. It's just, you're kind of free-formly inputting and some output is coming. And, it, like, the fact that you can tell very quickly that it's like not really a game removes a lot of the value to me as a game. Now it might have value as something else, right? Something somewhere else on the map of what people do. But I don't see that as an evolution of games exactly. And so now there may be, so, the examples you started with about like generating an image based on a mixture of inputs or something is kind of a constrained version of this. And it might be that people find useful constraints of how to make something happen that's like still a game, but also has this. But it's not obvious to me what's good there.
Yeah.
But I do think it's inevitable that you start to see some of this stuff get used.
You could imagine, I don't know, suppose early levels you're playing as a child and you do a crayon drawing. Later levels you discover that your house is based on the scribbles that you did as a child. You could use it in artistic ways that has some. It's I guess it's another tool in the toolbox.
Like generating geometry for a house that is navigable and complies with all the constraints, and then like it's well designed. So like, again, I'm being a little bit silly here, but like I'm shooting at a dude and I try to duck around the corner and now I get caught on this like thing because it wasn't like when people design shooter levels, they like streamline them in certain ways so that you don't have these bad play experiences. Right. And like, okay, you could maybe somehow train an AI to do all that, but it's not easy, man.
No, but in some ways that is the bit of it that seems to be emerging, is that all the things that we thought humans were going to forever be unique in our abilities to do.
I don't like that whole line of thing.
Okay.
Not that it's true or false. I just don't think about things that way in terms of like, oh, the magic of being a person. Like, there is a magic of being a human, but I think it's been misdiagnosed by most people most of the time. And so it's just very, I don't know.
Well, I guess there is a sense in which when you're participating in an artistic experience, a piece of what's happening is that you're having a human-to-human encounter. The person who made the game has a life that is, has an inner life that's similar to yours, the human experience. And when you see that they've made a corridor in a certain way, maybe that tells you something about maybe them as a human.
Maybe, but like, as soon as you have AI well enough that it could talk to you like a person, people will just believe that it has a subjective experience. It doesn't even matter if it does or not, which I think that whole way of thinking about things is like not the right framing, which is why it doesn't make any sense to try to come up with answers there. But nevertheless, it doesn't matter because people, if you have a robot that could just walk around and act like a person, people will treat it like a person. That's.
But if somebody wrote something using GPT-3 that was this existential text, and I read it and felt understood, like, wow, this is philosophically interesting to me, and then I learned that it had been written by an AI, that does substantially change how I feel about the text.
Well, okay, but I think that's again because the way that we're generating this text right now, like I said, it doesn't, like it knows what it's writing, but it also doesn't know what it's writing in such a way that what comes out is kind of a gimmick in a certain way, right? This doesn't have to do with fundamentally whether it was written by a robot or a human being. If you had a robot who was as good at thinking as a human being, would you feel that way about it? I don't know. Maybe that's something where people just will disagree on an individual basis, but I don't think, like I certainly would feel like I had one put over on me if I discovered that. But that's because of the nature of the current process that generates these texts. I don't think it's inherent in it being machine generated. Like here's the thing, all right? So on the one hand, we're conscious human beings who walk around and have living experiences and so forth. On the other hand, when you're talking to somebody, like I'm doing right now, right? I'm saying these sentences in this video. Where do the words come from? Like, am I consciously choosing every single word? No. Like, I feel like I am. And we do have conscious processes where we stop and deliberate about what we're going to think sometimes, but we don't usually do that. Usually the words just come out, right? And they happen to be in accordance with what I believe I was wanting to say at the time. If that weren't true, we wouldn't be able to speak fluidly. It would take way too long to like make words. And so if you know, this is something that anyone with even a little bit of meditation experience can do, is you look at what's your actual conscious experience, right? Versus these other things that we intellectually think about ourselves as human beings. And like, okay, if I think and I'm choosing what I say, why can't I see that? Why am I not conscious of that process? Well, I don't know. It happens somewhere unconsciously. And so there's two things about that. A, you don't know what that process is by which those words come out. They just show up and then you observe them showing up out of your mouth, right? And B, therefore, it doesn't necessarily have that much to do with the experience of being human at some level because you don't know most of that experience. The words are just there, right? And so feeling differently about words generated by a computer is strange because you don't really know, like your words that you are saying came from outside of you in some sense, in that you don't have introspective capability to it. You're just, your brain is kind of programmed to accept them and feel good about them as belonging. It's like your immune system is not rejecting this experience of these words coming out, but where do they come from? It's actually, it's a very, very basic thing that almost like we all just ignore all the time, right?
Right.
But the point being, do I have much reason to believe that words generated by a computer are that much different from words generated by me? No, I don't.
I mean, there's the philosophical zombie idea, right? Where you could talk to somebody who claimed to have consciousness and showed every external sign of genuine consciousness, but in fact there was no first person experience, there was no inner life. It was like or the Chinese room experiment. You know,
yeah, I don't think any of those really make sense. And the reason they don't make sense. So there's this mystery that starts all these questions, which is like, we're conscious beings in a universe that we perceive, and that's like happening, right? As opposed to, you could imagine some dead universe where like mechanical
Just like a
things are
marble
going on
run.
and there's
Yeah.
no perception, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
why is that? And that's a fundamental question, right? But then we imagine, because we have this Western cultural background, we imagine that our conscious experience is somehow produced by a machine in some way. That's what it comes
Right,
down
it's an
to. Right?
emergent property.
Right. But nobody can explain how this would happen, and nobody even has a good working idea. There's all sorts of ideas where people start to try to explain this, like, integrated information theory or something, but like they all fundamentally don't really make sense, right? And so if you don't give any credence, let's not even, I won't try to convince people of one thing or the other. Let's just say you don't give any special credence to the idea that consciousness could be created mechanistically or not. Just like I 50-50 on that, I have no idea. Then you
Right.
would have no predisposition toward these things, like the Chinese room or, any of that stuff, philosophical zombie kind of stuff, because it's like, well, that whole thing rests on this foundation of an idea that I don't have any reason to believe or not believe, right? You just know that consciousness is, and then you don't know how it comes to be. And so why would you believe that it could be specifically made to come to be in certain situations and not in others, right?
I've always viewed the existence of conscious thought and experience versus what seems to me to be actually, it seems almost patently obvious that it couldn't be an emergent property, as evidence that we don't live in a purely material reality. Like there must be some spiritual realm that is different from. You described the empty universe with atoms bouncing around. Since that is clearly the state of play, were you to assume we understood everything just from the laws of physics, there must be something else beyond the kind of empirical scientific world that is portrayed.
That's one way to think about it. But the word beyond there is also sort of doing a lot of stealth work because so we just, there's a lot of different ways you could think about it, right? I mean, and we're so on the one hand, in the West, we have a very rich and strong tradition of thinking about the world that has been tremendously useful and has done a large amount of work and has enabled us to raise our standard of living and also do all sorts of horrible things, but it has proved its usefulness, right? On the other hand, we're always in this constant struggle of figuring out which parts are a little bit wrong, right? And tuning those, because if you think you know everything, you can't learn what you need to in the future, right? And so obviously we don't know everything right now. And so we need to like open some windows a little bit. And so, well, you started out by invoking this picture of, okay, there's like the mechanical universe, as it's sometimes called. And then obviously we're in that plus something, right? But even saying we're in that plus something, or maybe, or whatever, is like, it invokes this idea of the mechanical universe, which is a picture from the 1800s that nobody believes anymore, right? But we still use it as a picture, right? So when you say like, what is that? Like, what are atoms? It's like, well, actually, they happen to be vibrations in fields that happen to be coherent over time. And what is time exactly? And by the time you build out the whole picture, it's not even that surprising that we don't know everything about it, because it's this really crazy kind of nutty thing. Like, even what I just said is not really true, because like there's the whole quantum interference
right.
aspect to it of like things going different
Yeah.
ways.
Is
and
it a
then
wave? Is it a
cohering.
particle?
No, it's all waves. It's not a particle, but like
But if you send photons through double slits, they
yeah,
appear
yeah.
at
It's
specific
that
points, right?
yes, but the answer to all that is it's actually all waves. It's just which ones we observe, right?
Fine.
But yeah, like it's just so we still use these pictures though. Everybody,
Yeah.
including me, we use these pictures that are out of date because we haven't fully grappled with the ramifications of the new picture. We don't have full, like we know certain things and we haven't got mental closure around everything we know, and we haven't integrated all these things with each other to form a new picture that makes sense to us that we can then use to move forward, right?
Yeah.
And so when we start with these things that we already know are not right, it's not that surprising that we end up with things that are confusing or paradoxical or don't make sense. It's like, yeah, but duh, you already know that the line one proposition that you set out is not really right.
It seems like there's things that we have very strong intuitive beliefs about, and then there are things that we have to believe because we read something about somebody we vaguely trust having done an experiment, and there's this long chain of beliefs. But something like good and evil, right? I think most people, however deeply convinced they are about moral relativity intellectually, they act in a day-to-day way and have this deep feeling of like, there is good, there is evil. And I don't know why we would discount that kind of intuitive knowledge that we can gain just by living. Like something, in some way we have access to this knowledge that is it's just a deep-baked belief about how the world works, that there is a kind of moral realm that is objective. Now, we don't have a way to measure that. We can't do a CERN experiment that gives us 20 decimal places of confidence, but we do sometimes I think throw away all of the things that we know from a gut level just completely in our excitement about the empirical method. Things that we can measure, again, like not everything that matters in life is measurable. I mean, that could be shown by the fact that if you run your company based on things that you can measure, it eventually you run into a brick wall where people who can take aesthetics into consideration just, can ignore the quantifiable world and just charge ahead. They can like overtake you. And I wonder if this is a side effect of the, we went through the Enlightenment, we made all of these things that you allude to that have been remarkably effective technologies, and we then try and apply the same thinking to problems that, like, is there an empirical answer to where consciousness comes from? Seems not. It seems that is just a problem that's inaccessible from a sort of
We
scientific
certainly
method.
do not have a current framework that is able to deliver us progress on that answer from a scientific point of view. Now, of course,
Yeah.
you can go to the spiritual traditions and listen to what they have to say, but then you're in the position of trying to make a judgment on who to believe because they say conflicting things, right?
Yeah.
And you're outside the scientific method at that point, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this. So you started that one by talking about morality, and this is a thing again. I think we are morally confused in some basic way, right? So, for example, we have enlightenment values of reason and so forth, and there are certain things that most people wouldn't argue with, at least not in polite company, such as like, oh, all human beings have equal value, and if if I die or you die or the guy down the street dies, those are all equally tragic. Or I don't know, maybe you would
But
handle
I'd
everyone like-
argue that that is really an inherited Christian idea, and
Sure. Well, but
through
but,
most of history and around the world, that's not been an opinion.
yeah, that could be, but it's that is one of the ideas that at least in the West we hold relatively highly, at least in polite company. I don't think most people actually believe that in reality.
Right.
They don't behave well. This is the important thing: is they don't behave that way because, again,
Yeah.
going back in time evolutionarily, the guy who says it doesn't matter to me if I die or you die versus the guy who says I'm going to live out of this situation. The guy who says I'm going to live is the guy who survives, right?
Yeah,
And so-
and the tribe who cares about people who are similar to them propagates their DNA better than the
Yes,
tribe
and so
of
there's
people.
there's historically a force against this idea, which is maybe why the idea is valuable, right? Because it helps us create a bubble, an environment that would not exist, and so that the denying the reality of that thing a little bit is what is a technology that helps us create something that's a little bit elevated. Now, the thing that is perplexing about this is not even the part that I've said so far, right? It's that this evolutionary aspect that we just mentioned, where the guy who says I'm more important than you wins, is an aspect of the fundamental action of the universe, right? It's like, that's why we're even here in the first place. It's not even just like a thing that's acting on our psychology. It's like why we ever got organisms complex enough to eventually become humans is because of a mind-boggling, staggering amount of repetition of this kind of process over and over and over across time, right? So in some sense, when we say, so both, morally speaking, or even to abandon the Christian morals for a second, from like a game theory perspective, if you take like a global view and you just view people as units, like they're obviously all interchangeable with each other in some way. And so there's also just like an abstract intellectual reasoning way of coming to this
It's kind of a
conclusion.
beautiful idea in a mathematical sense, never mind the moral sense.
Yes, but it's fundamentally in conflict with the action of the entire universe. Like, if the universe held this moral that we hold, we could not exist. And so in some sense, we're saying, so we can, on the one hand, have a relatively sophisticated way of trying to think about this, which is like, okay, contextually, from the standpoint of an individual human being and what I should believe, I believe this, but I do not apply it broadly because
Yeah.
it doesn't make sense. Or, like, I think what we do too often, because we don't like thinking that hard, is we just apply these things broadly. Like, of course this is true, and there's no boundary on the bounds of that truth and where it applies. And that's nonsensical, because you're saying you know better than the universe that created you, which is a little bit pompous, if I may say so, given that we don't even understand it. Like, maybe someday we would understand it well enough to say something like that and actually have it be true. But right now it is so woefully untrue, it's crazy.
But ontologically, how can we ever trust our reasoning or our senses to tell us truth? If
Oh, Donald
If
Norman
all-
would say you can't.
okay,
I don't know.
I mean, there's something sort of self-defeating about that line of thinking, because if your conclusion, therefore, is that you can't trust anything that you believe, then that could never become your belief, because you wouldn't trust even that conclusion itself.
But we already have to deal with this, right? So going back to the whole world politics situation we were discussing
Yeah.
like 3 conversations ago, right?
Yeah.
It's very difficult even to have, there's different levels of what you would call true, right? But even at a mundane level, it is very difficult to attain information that you have high confidence is true. And so we're always acting in a provisional mode where we say, given what I kind of think is true, I'm deciding on the best actions, right? And that's really the job of morals, right? And actually, this this prevents, there's all sorts of these like philosophical gotcha problems that are set up of like, how should you behave, given this situation or that situation, and the problem is that these all treat your knowledge as like an absolutely, well, unless uncertainty is formulated in the thing, usually they treat it as an absolutely certain point sample of like what you know, right? But you're uncertain about what you know, and you're uncertain about what you're able to do. And so if you think about these as like Gaussians or whatever, then taking action in the world is like multiplying a bunch of these together, and every time you multiply them, they get fuzzier and fuzzier, right? And so what this should do is prevent us from being too, again, going back to the thing about how people are super judgmental and super critical about everything now. It's like, well, these are my beliefs, but I should apply some fuzz around all of them. And because there's some fuzz there, that should introduce fuzz in the judgment, because I'm not absolutely certain about any of these things. But we don't seem to do that,
well,
right? Which is another tell that we're not really reasoning.
That we're not actually rational beings.
Yeah.
If we were truly rational about that fuzz that you were describing, I think we would have to conclude that we don't know anything to any degree of certainty. I mean, just in order to act at all, I think we have to presuppose some level of predictability about the universe. We have to presuppose some ability to understand the universe. We have to presuppose some ability to have predictable cause and effect, that we can act in the universe and that act is predictable, and that we have some better than chance moral code, that the things we think are good are better than the things that we think are bad. If all of those aren't true, there would be no reason to act. In fact,
and also, making wise choices. For example, I'm going to constrain the majority of my actions to the region where I have higher confidence that I know what's true, right? And spend less effort agonizing about things where I don't know. Maybe my effort there should be involved in improving my understanding, but it shouldn't necessarily be in taking especially irreversible actions based on my understanding, which is clearly uncertain, right?
That's one of the things I've decided for myself in the last year or so is I'm not going to put any of my efforts towards things that I can't directly see the outcome of. Because I think it's just too often the case that you see people acting for the best of intentions who've been told a 4 or 5 stage distance from their effect. I'm going to do this because it will affect that, which will on and on. And the belief is that you understand the world well enough that you can predict a chain of causes and effects that's that long. And I think we just obviously don't understand the world well enough to make predictable actions that are going to have good effects that far removed from us as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, but somehow we manage to go from day to day and do things, right?
Well, I think if you take that pragmatic line that says, I'm going to assume that the world is interpretable, I'm going to assume that there is a morality, that I have some access to the morality, in some ways, although I have no reason to believe those things are true, it then pushes me to say, well, given that all of that is true, I can't believe in a completely random universe, because that wouldn't produce those properties that I need.
Again, evolutionarily speaking, if you have a guy in the middle of a field and he's like, I can't know what's true, and I don't know if that's a tree, and I don't know if that's a rock, that guy gets eaten by a lion. The end,
Yeah.
right? And
Right.
so we are predisposed to believe.
But Kant would no, not Kant. Descartes would said, well, what if all of my senses were taken over by a demon, right?
Sure.
And he kind of spawned skepticism as a movement. Not deliberately. That wasn't what he was intending to do. But lots of people said, well, that's a very good point, Descartes. Maybe my eyes are deceiving me. Maybe my sense. If you had a malevolent, or to take this a sort of simulation perspective on this, like, what if all of our scientific experiments only yield the data that the people running the simulation want us to receive, and therefore we can't trust any of our scientific results, no matter how reliable and repeatable they are? We could be being messed with.
Well,
but
even
you have to assume that's not true, because otherwise you can't act.
You can't do anything. Yeah. I mean, at a more basic level, again, so something that even people with a little bit of meditation experience can do, again, is notice what is their actual, like, conscious experience when you're looking around and seeing things and hearing things, which is the whole mystery that we were talking about before, and that is not sufficiently explained. There's a difference between that and the operational way you interact with objects in the world, right? So somehow you have this sense perception, and then you have a projection, a mental projection onto that sense projection of, like, oh, that's a jar of tea over there. I know what that is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those things are different. And the fact that they're different is independent of the question of how well do they correspond or how accurate is each one. And it just, once you learn to observe that, which doesn't take very long, it at least brings a little bit of clarity, because you see, certainly the mental projections can be wrong, and often are. But even, as you say, the actual perceptual component, well, it's also fictitious to some degree. We know very specific examples about this, like your blind spot gets filled in or whatever. Like what you perceive is not the photons that are landing on your eye, like not remotely. And so it's just useful to be mindful of both of those things.
Yeah.
And at the same time, not be paralyzed by these things.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah.
Is technology, and in particular entertainment technology, games, a force for good in the world? Is the development of new technology, the production of increasingly entertaining games, to the benefit of humanity?
I don't know. It's very hard to think about, because the scale is so big. Like, video games are very popular, right? Different kinds of games are popular with different kinds of people, but the scale at which they operate is quite large. And, things like Twitter and Facebook are also sort of video games. We don't call them that, and I wouldn't necessarily call them that seriously, but that's sort of what they are too. And so,
well, Meta in particular seems like a video
well,
game, right?
They're trying to go further that way for sure. Not very well yet. So we'll see. We'll see what happens there.
Yeah, how much did they spend in the last year to develop
A lot.
the Meta?
A lot of money. I wish I had a little bit of that money. I could do some stuff with it. But
Billions of pounds, yeah.
it's a lot. But yeah, so anything that's even slightly good or slightly bad is multiplied by the number of people whom it affects, right? And so even, like, imagine you just released a chemical into the atmosphere of Earth that made everybody's life 1% worse. That's actually really bad, because it's like everybody in the world is 1% worse, even though 1% doesn't sound like a lot. right?
Yeah.
And so video games are like that. And I don't know, because it's very complex. I try to do things that are mostly good. Other people don't care or want to do things that mostly benefit themselves. And as we've said, evolutionarily, the people who don't care probably win. I probably lose in that fight. If that's why I wish I had billions of dollars from Facebook, because I don't have billions of dollars, because I didn't make, all these, phone games and stuff that are like try to go viral and get
It's kind
you
of a
to put all your friends in
catch-22
them
because
and whatever.
by definition, the people who have the most control are those who have the fewest principles constraining them.
Yeah. It's not 100% true. I know some people who have done very well in games who are like really solid people, and who want the best for players, but it's certainly a lot easier to just be exploitative. And you know what? Most people who try to be exploitative just fail anyway, and they don't make good games that people want to play. But when they succeed, they could succeed pretty big, right? And so all of this is just at play all the time. And I just hope that we have a net positive impact, but I honestly don't really know. And my concern is not, especially going back in time, when I say that I'm not sure how good video games are, people usually think I'm talking about violence or something, but that's not. That's not what I'm talking about. I don't think violence is that much of an issue. If there is an issue with video game violence, it's more about damaging people's aesthetics and their sensibilities and their emotional responsiveness. It's not about like we're making people violent by having them play violent games. I don't think that's a thing. But really, I think the danger is sapping people's energy and diverting it into this activity that is unproductive, right? And in fact, causes your muscles to atrophy and your brain to atrophy in these things, right? And some games do that a lot more than other games. And so we just need to be careful about that, right? I think there are a lot of positive aspects to games. I wouldn't be working in games if I didn't think so. But they have to be worth the time that you spend in front of them, right? Any hour that you have in a day, you could spend doing this or you could spend doing that. And in the end, how good of an idea was it to spend 3,000 hours playing this one game, which people do? 3,000 hours is a lot of time, right?
Yeah.
That's, what is that? That's like, 50 hours a week times, 50 weeks a year, times 20 hours a week, times 3 years. It's half of a full-time job for 3 years, for example. You can do a lot in that amount of time.
Or you could do absolutely nothing working a full-time job in a big tech
Well,
company.
that is true, right? And so it is, it's not clear, is all I'm saying. It's not clear what are the big things that we really need to worry about.
Well, I can't think of much better of a use of 2.5 hours than having talked to you about a big range of issues. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I'm very grateful for you having joined me. Is there any last thoughts you want to leave people with? People might be interested to know what you're working on at the moment, for example.
So I've got a number of projects on my plate, but designing and programming a programming language to replace the languages that I had used in the past, because they're bogged down by complexity and bad decision making, and it was having a very serious impact on my quality of life. And so that's been ongoing for 8 years. And we've got a beta community using
Let us
that.
have a go with it. We want to switch our lives over to Jay.
And then the game and the game engine are programmed in this language. And so that's no small endeavor. That's part of, like, all of these things have been happening at once. The game, the programming language, was sort of part-time for the first 2 years because I was finishing up the last game project, which was really big and complicated. They're all big and complicated, but yeah. And so, for the past 6 years, it's been that language plus a game plus an engine, and then plus a re-release of another game. And some of this was supposed to have happened already and hasn't, but it's just because there's so many things going on. It's kind of nuts. Like, you know, again, for a small company this size, we're like 15 people right now. Most people wouldn't even try to make one game with 15 people. We're making a game plus an engine plus a programming language plus a re-release of another game. It's a lot. So that's why I'm tired right now. That's why I look tired. But hopefully in the end it will have been worth it.
Amazing. Well, best of luck with all of those things. I'm definitely going to be watching with close interest. Anybody who's watched the stream and enjoyed it and isn't subscribed to my channel, why not subscribe? I'm hoping to have more interesting conversations like this. Maybe I'll even manage to have Jonathan back one day. That would be wonderful. So thanks once again, Jonathan Blow, everybody.
Thanks for listening, whoever's listening. And